He had rehearsed his smile in the bathroom mirror 3 times before leaving the house that evening, making sure it looked natural, making sure it didn't betray the terror underneath. Marcus Hale hadn't been on a date in 4 years. 4 years of school lunches packed at 6 in the morning, 4 years of braiding his daughter's hair with clumsy learning hands, 4 years of falling asleep on the couch with a half-eaten bowl of cereal because the exhaustion simply swallowed him whole before he could make it to bed. 4 years of being everything to a little girl named Rosie and nothing at all to himself. So when his coworker set him up with a woman named Celeste, he told himself it was just dinner, just conversation, just one night of being a man again, and not only a father. What he didn't know was that by the end of that dinner, the entire foundation of his carefully rebuilt life would crack open, and something far more complicated and far more painful would pour out. The restaurant was upscale but not intimidating. The kind of place with white tablecloths and soft lighting that made everyone look a little more forgiving of themselves. Marcus arrived 7 minutes early, which felt right. He straightened his navy blazer in the reflection of the window.
Welcome to AK Stories, a place where simple moments turn into unforgettable stories of love, kindness, and hope. If stories like this touch your heart, make sure to like this video, share it with a friend, leave a comment below, and subscribe to AK Stories so you never miss a story like this.
And reminded himself to breathe. He was 41 years old. He had buried his wife, raised a child alone, kept a job, kept a home, kept going. Surely he could manage one dinner. Celeste walked in at exactly 7 o'clock, and the room seemed to reorganize itself around her. She wore a white dress, simple and elegant, her dark hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. Her eyes the kind of quiet gray-green that made you feel like you were standing at the edge of a calm sea. She smiled when she saw him, a careful smile, a considered one, and Marcus felt something loosen in his chest that had been knotted there for years. They sat across from each other at the white draped table, and the conversation came easier than he expected. He told her about his work as a structural engineer, about the way he loved solving problems that had physical weight, real consequence. She listened with full attention, not the performative kind that people gave while waiting for their turn to speak, but the genuine, leaning in kind that made a person feel heard all the way down to their bones. He told her about Rosie, his 9-year-old daughter, and how she had recently become obsessed with building model bridges out of popsicle sticks because she had seen him draw blueprints at the kitchen table. He laughed telling the story, and it was a real laugh, the kind that surprised him by coming out at all. Celeste smiled at that, a softer smile this time. Something flickered behind her eyes, not quite sadness, but something adjacent to it, something that passed through and disappeared before he could name it. He noticed it, then let it go. People carried things. He of all people understood that. The dinner continued beautifully. They talked about travel, about books, about the strange intimacy of cooking alone versus cooking for someone. She was warm and sharp and funny, and Marcus found himself thinking, somewhere around the second glass of water, that maybe his coworker had been right. Maybe he had been ready for this. Maybe the world still had room for him in it as a full person, not just as Rosie's dad. When the plates were cleared and the soft hum of the restaurant settled around them like a held breath, he leaned back in his chair and told her honestly that this had been one of the best evenings he had experienced in years. He meant it completely. He watched her face when he said it, and for just a moment, her expression did something he couldn't understand. It crumpled, barely, at the edges like a piece of paper held too close to a flame. She looked down at the table. Then she looked back up at him, and the composed, lovely face she had worn all evening shifted into something else, something heavier, something that had been waiting the entire night to come forward. She told him she had something to say, and she needed him to hear it all the way through before he responded. Marcus would later describe the next 10 minutes as the strangest of his life, not because they were dramatic in the way movies are dramatic, with raised voices and shattering glass, but because they were quiet, devastatingly, painfully quiet. Celeste spoke in a low, steady voice, and every word landed like a stone dropped into still water, the rings spreading outward through everything he thought he knew about the evening. She told him that she did know him not personally, but she knew of him. She told him that 4 years ago, her younger sister had been in a car accident on a rainy Thursday evening on the interstate outside the city. She told him that her sister had been pregnant, alone, frightened, and that a stranger had stopped his car on the shoulder of that highway and stayed with her for 40 minutes until the ambulance came. He had held her hand. He had talked to her, calmly, steadily, the way you talk to someone who is terrified and slipping. He had told the paramedics her name and her condition and everything he had observed, and his clear-headed account had helped them make decisions in the first critical minutes of her care. Celeste's sister had survived. The baby, however, had not. Her sister had spent months afterward trying to find the man who had stopped. She had only a fragmented description: a dark car, a man in a blazer, dark hair, kind eyes, calm voice. She had described him to Celeste so many times, so desperately, because she said she needed to thank him. Not for saving the baby. There had been nothing that could be done for the baby, but for making sure she didn't die alone on the side of a highway in the rain. For making sure that in the worst moment of her life, a human being had sat beside her and refused to leave. Celeste's sister had died 6 months ago. A different illness, unrelated, sudden and completely unfair. And in her things, Celeste had found a journal, and in that journal, page after page about the stranger on the highway. About how his presence had changed something in her. About how she had never stopped looking for him. About how she believed, in the way grieving people sometimes need to believe, that he had been sent to her that night for a reason. When Marcus's coworker had mentioned him to Celeste at a mutual friends gathering, mentioned his name, his profession, his daughter, the night 4 years ago when he had stopped on the interstate because he saw a car in a ditch and couldn't drive past, Celeste had felt the floor shift beneath her. She had asked, carefully, if she could meet him, not to confront him, not even to tell him any of this necessarily, just to see him. Just to sit across from the person who had been her sister's guardian angel on the worst night of her life and look at him and know he was real. She had not expected him to be funny. She had not expected him to love his daughter the way he clearly did, openly and completely and without apology. She had not expected to feel, over the course of one dinner, that her sister would have liked him very much. Marcus sat very still for a long time after she finished speaking. The restaurant moved softly around them, the distant sound of a fork against a plate, the low murmur of other conversations, the gentle mechanical breath of the air system overhead. He was not a man who cried easily. He had trained himself out of it in those early months after losing his wife, because Rosie had needed him solid and upright. But sitting there, across from this woman who had carried a story about him for months without his knowledge, he felt his eyes fill completely. He remembered that night. He remembered it with the clarity that only certain moments possess, the kind that embed themselves in the body rather than just the memory. He remembered the rain and the silence after he turned his hazard lights on, and the way the woman in the other car had been frightened beyond words but holding herself together with everything she had. He remembered talking to her, not about anything meaningful, just talking, keeping the sound of a human voice in the space between them. He had not thought of himself as doing anything remarkable. He had thought only that this was a person, and she was alone, and he was not going to leave. He had never known what happened to her afterward. He had given his information to the paramedics and driven home and held Rosie a little longer than usual that night. He had thought about the woman occasionally in the months that followed, wondered if she and the baby had been all right. He had never found out. Now, sitting in this quiet restaurant 4 years later, he found out. He found out in the way life sometimes delivers its closed loops, not cleanly, not painlessly, but with a fullness that rearranges you from the inside out. If this story reached something inside you, if it reminded you that the small things we do for strangers can echo forward in ways we will never fully see, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Your support keeps these stories alive and makes sure they reach the people who need them most. And before we close, drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever done something kind for a stranger and never known what became of them? Your story matters. We want to read it. Marcus and Celeste sat at that table for another hour after she finished speaking. They did not talk about whether there would be another dinner or what any of it meant going forward. They talked about her sister, her laugh, her stubbornness, the way she had documented hope in a journal even in the depths of grief. They talked about Rosie and her popsicle stick bridges. They talked about all the ways love, in its most determined form, refuses to be stopped by death or distance, or the terrible randomness of rainy Thursday evenings on a highway. When they finally stepped out into the cool night air, Marcus looked up at the sky for a long moment. Then he quietly thanked her for coming, not for the reason she had originally come, but for all the reasons that had grown up around it, like something green pushing through concrete, insisting on existing, insisting on the light.